uncovering Stillwater's dark secret, a haunting silence you can't escape. Chapter 1: A New Beginning. Evelyn Turner leaned back in the passenger seat, her eyes tracing the lush landscape as their car wound its way through the narrow roads of Stillwater. The town, nestled deep within the countryside, appeared untouched by time. Wooden houses, their paint weathered but still charming, lined the streets, each with a neat garden bursting with late summer blooms. The air was clean and fragrant, a sharp contrast to the thick, smoggy atmosphere they had left behind in the city. It was everything they had dreamed of, a retreat from the relentless noise and rush of urban life. Mark, focused on the road, seemed equally entranced by their new surrounding. "It's perfect, isn't it?" he said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and anticipation. He had always longed for this, a place where they could settle down, maybe even start a family. "Yes," Evelyn replied softly, though something in the back of her mind prickled with unease. The town was beautiful, almost unnaturally so. There was something in the stillness that felt unnatural. She shook off the feeling, telling herself it was just the anxiety of the move. When they pulled into the driveway of their new home, a quaint cottage at the edge of the town, they were greeted by a small group of townspeople. Neighbors, Evelyn assumed, though their faces were unfamiliar. An older man with a kind smile stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "Welcome to Stillwater," he said warmly. "I'm Mr. Thompson, and this is my wife Ellen. We're so glad you've joined our little community." The others introduced themselves, each more cordial than the last. There was a simplicity about them, an air of contentment that Evelyn found comforting, if a little disconcerting. It was as if they had no worries, no burdens, as if the outside world didn't exist beyond the borders of Stillwater. As the day wore on, the Turners unpacked their belongings, settling into the cozy cottage that would now be their home. The house itself was modest but charming. Creaky wooden floors and a fireplace that Evelyn could already imagine curling up beside on chilly nights. She let herself relax, the earlier unease slowly fading away. Later that evening, as they strolled through the town, Evelyn and Mark marveled at how quiet it was. There were no sounds of traffic, no distant hum of activity, just the whisper of the breeze through the trees and the occasional murmur of conversation from behind closed doors. It was a profound silence, almost reverent, and Evelyn found herself speaking in hushed tones without meaning to. Wasn't long before they encountered the first group of children. A trio of them, 2 boys and a girl, were sitting on a stone wall, their faces blank as they watched the newcomers with wide, unblinking eyes. Evelyn smiled and waved, expecting the usual shy response, but the children merely nodded, their expressions unchanging. "Hello there," Mark said cheerfully, attempting to engage them. "What are your names?" The children exchanged glances, and the eldest boy, after a long pause, answered in a flat tone. "I'm Peter. This is Samuel and Grace." "Nice to meet you, Peter," Evelyn said, her smile faltering slightly as the children continued to stare at them, unmoving. "Do you like living here in Stillwater?" Peter nodded, but there was no enthusiasm in the gesture, no light in his eyes. "It's nice," he replied, his voice devoid of any real feeling. The other 2 remained silent, their gaze steady and unsettling. The Turners exchanged a puzzled look but decided not to press further. As they walked away, Evelyn couldn't shake the odd sensation that the children's silence was more than just shyness. It was almost as if they were afraid to speak. Or worse, as if they had been taught not to. "Well-behaved kids," Mark commented, though there was a note of confusion in his voice. "A bit too quiet, though, don't you think?" Evelyn nodded absently, her thoughts swirling. There was something strange about the way the children had looked at them, something unsettling in their empty expressions. The town, for all its charm, was starting to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a place where secrets were buried just beneath the surface. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, the Turners made their way back to the cottage. The streets were deserted, the only sounds the crunch of gravel under their shoes and the distant call of an owl. The silence, which had initially seemed peaceful, now felt heavy, oppressive, as though the town itself was holding its breath. Inside the cottage, Mark lit a fire, and they sat together on the worn sofa, flickering flames casting a warm glow over the room. Evelyn tried to push the strange encounter out of her mind, focusing instead on the coziness of their new home. But as the night wore on, quiet pressed in on her, and she found herself straining to hear something, anything that would break the eerie stillness. In the silence, her thoughts grew louder, filled with questions she couldn't yet articulate. Why were the children so quiet? What was it about this town that made her feel so uneasy? As she drifted off to sleep, these questions lingered, unresolved, and in the darkness, the silence of Stillwater seemed to deepen, wrapping around the cottage like a shroud. Chapter 2: The Unspoken Rules. The days in Stillwater passed quietly, almost too quietly, as Evelyn and Mark settled into their new routine. Mark threw himself into their fresh start, eager to become a part of the community. He spent his mornings fixing up the cottage and his afternoons helping neighbors with small tasks, chatting easily with anyone who would listen. To him, the town was everything they had hoped for: peaceful, friendly, a perfect place to build a future. But Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The initial charm of Stillwater had dulled, leaving her with an unsettling sense of unease. The silence that had once felt serene now seemed stifling, as if the town itself was keeping secrets, pressing them down beneath its tranquil surface. She began to notice other things, too, small details that might have gone unnoticed if not for the children's strange behavior. The way adults in the town exchanged glances whenever the topic of the children came up, the way their voices would lower, their smiles tighten, the way the children themselves would stand motionless, watching with those same blank expressions, their lips sealed as if by some unseen force. Mark dismissed her worries, brushing them aside with a light-hearted laugh. "You're overthinking things, Eve," he'd say, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "These kids are just well-behaved. It's refreshing, isn't it? Not like in the city." But Evelyn couldn't shake the sense that she was missing something important. And so, one afternoon, when Mark was busy with yet another neighborly task, she decided to explore the town on her own, hoping to uncover whatever it was that made her feel so ill at ease. She wandered the streets, her steps slow and deliberate, taking in the quaint houses with their neat gardens, the tidy sidewalks where not a single piece of litter could be found. Everything was in its place, perfectly maintained, as if disorder itself was unwelcome here. The people she passed offered her polite nods, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. Evelyn returned their greetings, but her thoughts were elsewhere. It was as she was nearing the edge of town, where the houses grew sparse and the trees thicker, that she saw her, an elderly woman sitting on a wooden bench outside a small cottage, her wrinkled hands busy with a piece of knitting. There was something different about her, something that caught Evelyn's attention. Perhaps it was the way she seemed less hurried than the others, her movements unhurried, her gaze unflinching as she watched Evelyn approach. "Good afternoon," Evelyn said, offering a tentative smile. The woman looked up, her eyes sharp, observant. She nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement. "You're new here," the woman said, her voice raspy but strong. It wasn't a question, but Evelyn nodded anyway. "Yes, my husband and I just moved in a few days ago. I'm Evelyn Turner." "Mrs. Wilkins," the woman replied, setting her knitting aside. "You're curious, I can see that." Evelyn hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but something in the woman's gaze compelled her to speak. "It's just children here. They're so quiet. I've never seen anything like it, and the way the townspeople act around them, it's strange." Mrs. Wilkins' expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that told Evelyn she wasn't the first to notice. "They're good children," she said slowly, deliberately. "Well-behaved. The town prides itself on that. But why are they so silent?" Evelyn pressed. "It's not natural for children to be so restrained." The old woman's gaze drifted to the distance, her lips thinning into a line. For a long moment she didn't answer, and Evelyn wondered if she had pushed too far. But then Mrs. Wilkins spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are traditions here," she said. "Old traditions. They've been in place for as long as I can remember, and longer than that even. They keep the town peaceful, quiet. The children, they learn young. It's better that way." "Better?" Evelyn echoed, a chill running down her spine. "How can it be better to silence them like this?" Mrs. Wilkins looked back at her, and for the first time, Evelyn saw something akin to fear in her eyes. You wouldn't understand, not yet, but you will. In time, you'll come to see why things are the way they are. Before Evelyn could ask more, the old woman stood, gathering her knitting into a basket. It's getting late, she said, her tone final. You should be getting home before dark. Evelyn watched as Mrs. Wilkins retreated into her cottage, the door closing firmly behind her. She stood there for a moment, the unanswered questions swirling in her mind, before turning back toward town. The encounter left her more unsettled than ever, a sense of dread creeping in at the edges of her thoughts. That evening, Stillwater held a town gathering in the square. It was meant to be a casual affair, a chance for the Turners to meet more of their neighbors and integrate into the community. Mark was excited, eager to make connections, but Evelyn felt a growing sense of apprehension. The square was lit with lanterns, casting a warm glow over the gathered townsfolk. There was food, music, and laughter, but Evelyn noticed how, even here, the children were unnervingly quiet. They stood close to their parents, hands clasped, eyes downcast, their silence more pronounced in the midst of the festive atmosphere. As the evening wore on, Evelyn couldn't help but ask about the children. She brought it up casually, as if in passing, but the reaction was immediate. The townspeople exchanged looks, some startled, others wary, and the conversation around her grew quieter, more guarded. They're just well-mannered, someone said, a woman whose name Evelyn couldn't recall. We teach our children to respect their elders, to listen before they speak. Yes, another agreed quickly. We take pride in raising disciplined children. It's a tradition we hold dear. But there was something off in their explanations, something rehearsed, almost as if they were repeating a script they'd been given long ago. Evelyn noticed the way they avoided meeting her eyes, how they shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It was clear that this was not a topic they were willing to discuss openly. As the night drew to a close, Mark, oblivious to his wife's growing unease, chatted animatedly with a group of men. Evelyn watched him, noting how easily he was beginning to fit in, how quickly he was embracing the town's way of life. A pang of loneliness struck her, a realization that while Mark was finding his place, she was slipping further away, isolated by her suspicions. When they returned to the cottage, the silence of the town pressed down on her once more. Mark, cheerful and content, dismissed her concerns yet again, insisting that she was letting her imagination get the better of her. But Evelyn knew there was more to Stillwater than met the eye, and as she lay awake that night, listening to the oppressive quiet outside, she vowed to uncover the truth, no matter what it might cost. In the darkness, the town seemed to close in around her, secrets buried deep within the silence. Children. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Dark. The days grew shorter as the first hints of autumn settled over Stillwater, chill creeping into the air that seemed to match the cold dread taking root in Evelyn's heart. Her curiosity had turned into something much darker, an obsession that gnawed at her, refusing to let go. Mark had become distant, his enthusiasm for their new life in Stillwater shifting into something quieter, more subdued. He spent more time with the townspeople, often returning home late, his eyes shadowed with an intensity that was foreign to Evelyn. Whenever she tried to talk to him about her discoveries, he would listen for a moment, then brush her off with a tired smile, his patience worn thin. "It's just an old town," he would say, his tone clipped. "Let it go, Evelyn. We came here for peace, not to dig up the past." But Evelyn couldn't let it go. Not after what she had found. It had started with a visit to the town's library, a small, dusty building tucked away on a side street. The librarian, a thin, reedy man with a nervous twitch, had seemed surprised to see her. Few people in Stillwater, it seemed, had much interest in the written word. But Evelyn had pressed on, asking him for any records or history books about the town. He hesitated, then pointed her to a back room, where the oldest volumes were kept. The room was dim, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and neglect. Shelves lined the walls, packed with books that hadn't been touched in years. Evelyn felt a strange thrill as she began to search, her fingers trailing over the spines, brushing away dust and cobwebs. She had no idea what she was looking for, only that she needed to find it. And then, tucked between two crumbling ledgers, she found it. A thin, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and faded with age. The title, barely legible, read, "The Keeper of Stillwater." Evelyn's heart quickened as she opened it, the brittle pages crackling under her touch. The journal was old, written in a careful hand that spoke of a time long past. Told of the town's founding, of settlers who had come seeking a place to call their own. But the land they chose, the land that would become Stillwater, was not empty. It was guarded by something ancient, something that demanded obedience in exchange for prosperity. The Keeper, as it was called, was neither man nor beast, but a force that ruled the land with a silent, unseen hand. The settlers had made a pact with it, offering their children's voices as a tribute. In return, the town would flourish, untouched by the hardships that plagued the world beyond its borders. The silence of the children was the price of their peace. Evelyn's breath caught as she read the final entry, the words scrawled in a hurried, trembling script. "The children must remain silent. Keeper demands it. Those who break the silence suffer." She slammed the journal shut, her heart pounding. It was all there, in black and white, the explanation for the town's eerie tranquility. The children were not silent by choice. They were silenced by fear, conditioned from birth to obey an ancient, malevolent force that held the town in its thrall. Her mind reeled, the weight of what she had discovered pressing down on her like a physical burden. She felt sick, her stomach churning with a mix of fear and anger. She had to do something. She couldn't leave the children to suffer under this curse, not when she knew the truth. But what could she do? Who could she turn to in a town where everyone seemed complicit, where even Mark was slipping away from her, drawn into the town's dark embrace? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door creaking open. She looked up, startled, as a figure stepped into the room. It was a young girl, no older than 10, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were wide, filled with a terror that made Evelyn's blood run cold. The girl looked around nervously, as if afraid of being caught, then took a hesitant step forward. "Please," she whispered, her voice so soft that Evelyn had to strain to hear it. "You have to help us." Evelyn's heart twisted at the desperation in the child's voice. She reached out, taking the girl's trembling hand in her own. "What's your name?" she asked gently. The girl shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I can't say. I'm not supposed to talk to you. If they find out." "It's okay," Evelyn said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You can trust me. I want to help." For a moment, the girl hesitated. Then she pulled away, backing toward the door. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "It's not just the adults, the Keeper. It's always watching. If we break the silence, it will come for us." With that, she turned and fled, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the dim light, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Evelyn slumped against the table, her thoughts racing. The girl's terror had been palpable, her fear so raw that it had shaken Evelyn to her core. Keeper, whatever it was real, and it was still here, enforcing its ancient pact, ensuring that the children remained silent through fear of retribution. Evelyn knew she couldn't keep this to herself. She had to tell Mark, had to make him understand the danger they were in, the danger the children were in. But when she returned home, Mark was waiting for her, his expression closed, distant. "Where have you been?" he asked, his tone sharper than she'd ever heard it. "At the library," Evelyn said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I found something, Mark, something terrible." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Evelyn, not this again. You're letting your imagination run wild." "No, Mark, you have to listen to me," she insisted, stepping closer. "There's something wrong with this town, the children." "I'm tired, Evelyn," Mark interrupted, his voice flat. "I've had a long day. I don't want to hear any more of your wild theories." "Mark, please," Evelyn pleaded, her voice breaking. "You don't understand. The Keeper." "Enough." Mark's shout echoed through the small cottage, startling them both. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling. "Just let it go, Evelyn, for both our sakes." Evelyn stared at him, her heart sinking. The man she had married, the man who had once shared her every fear and joy, was slipping away from her, drawn into the town's dark, silent web. She could see it in his eyes, the way they had lost their warmth, their light. She turned away, unable to bear the sight of him like this. As she retreated to the bedroom, the dread that had been building inside her settled into a cold, hard knot. She was losing him, just as she was losing herself to the darkness of Stillwater. That night, as she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, Evelyn felt the weight of the town pressing down on her, the silence of its children echoing in her ears. The keeper was real, and it was watching, waiting, ready to punish those who dared to break the silence. But Evelyn couldn't give in, couldn't let the town's secrets consume her. She had to find a way to save the children, to break the curse that had held them captive for generations. And she had to do it before it was too late. For them, and for Mark. In the darkness, Evelyn made a silent vow. She would fight, no matter the cost, because she knew now beyond a shadow of a doubt that if she didn't, Stillwater would claim them both. Chapter 4. The Keeper's Demand. The air in Stillwater had thickened, as if the very atmosphere were preparing for something unspeakable. The leaves, which had once danced cheerfully in the autumn breeze, now hung lifeless on the trees, their colors muted. The town itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Evelyn could feel it too, the oppressive weight that had settled over everything. It was as though the town were bracing for a storm, one that everyone knew was coming, but no one dared acknowledge. The whispers that had always followed her through the streets, fallen silent, replaced by a suffocating hush that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. Mark had grown even more distant, his eyes glassy, his words mechanical. He spent his days at the side of Mr. Thompson, the town's leader, who had taken a particular interest in him. Evelyn could no longer reach him. He was a ghost in their home, a stranger who moved through the house without ever really being there. It was as though the Mark she had known was slowly being swallowed by the darkness that shrouded Stillwater. The ritual, they called it, the silent night. Evelyn had heard the phrase whispered in the grocery store, murmured by the post office, and passed in quiet conversation at the town square. But no one ever spoke of it directly. And the few times Evelyn had asked, she was met with nervous glances and abrupt changes of subject. It was clear that the silent night was something deeply ingrained in the town's history, something sacred and terribly feared. Her chance to understand came sooner than she expected. One evening, as dusk settled over the town, Evelyn found herself in the town hall, a small, unassuming building at the center of Stillwater. She had come looking for Mark, who had once again disappeared into the town's shadowy embrace, but instead she found Mr. Thompson. He stood at the end of the long, narrow room, tall, imposing figure silhouetted against the fading light. His back was to her, his hands clasped behind him, and for a moment Evelyn considered turning around and leaving. But something in the air held her in place, a sense of inevitability that she couldn't shake. "Mrs. Turner," Mr. Thompson said without turning around, his voice low and steady. "I was wondering when you'd come." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. "Where is Mark?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to sound composed. "He is where he needs to be," Mr. Thompson replied, his tone devoid of any warmth. He turned to face her, his eyes cold and piercing. "But you, Mrs. Turner, seem lost. Perhaps I can help you find your way." There was something about the way he said it that sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. She steeled herself, taking a deep breath. "I want to know about the silent night," she demanded, her voice firmer now. "I want to know what this town is hiding." Mr. Thompson regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he gestured for her to follow him. "Very well," he said. "Come with me." He led her through a side door and down a narrow corridor, the walls closing in around them like a coffin. They descended a set of creaking wooden stairs into the basement, air growing colder with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, Mr. Thompson paused in front of a heavy wooden door, its surface scarred and worn with age. "This," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is where it all began." He pushed the door open, revealing a small, dimly lit chamber. The walls were lined with ancient books and scrolls, their spines cracked and faded. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, its surface covered in strange symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering candlelight. Evelyn felt a surge of nausea as she stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of decay and something else, something older, more primal. She approached the altar, her heart pounding in her chest, and saw a book lying open on its surface, pages yellowed with age. This town, Mr. Thompson began, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife, was founded on a pact, an agreement between our ancestors and a force far older than any of us. The Keeper of Stillwater, they called it, an ancient spirit that demands silence in exchange for protection, prosperity. He gestured to the book, his eyes never leaving Evelyn's face. The children are the vessels of that silence. Their obedience, their submission, is the key to the town's survival. Every year, on the night when the veil between our world and the Keeper's is thinnest, we present our children to it, in a silent procession, binds them to its will. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the book, words on the page blurring as tears welled up in her eyes. "But why?" she whispered, voice cracking. "Why would you do this to your own children?" Mr. Thompson's expression softened, just for a moment, and Evelyn saw a flicker of something, regret perhaps or sorrow, before it was quickly masked. "Because it is necessary," he said, his tone resigned. "Without the Keeper, this town would fall. We would be consumed by the same darkness that plagues the world beyond our borders. The Keeper's demand is harsh, but it is the price we must pay for our peace." Evelyn shook her head, disbelief and horror warring within her. "But this is monstrous," she said, her voice rising. "These are children, not sacrifices." "They are both," Mr. Thompson replied coldly, "and we do what we must to ensure our survival." Evelyn's hands trembled as she backed away from the altar, the weight of what she had learned threatening to crush her. This town, this peaceful, idyllic place, was built on the backs of its children, their voices silenced to appease a spirit that demanded obedience. She looked at Mr. Thompson, her eyes burning with fury and desperation. "I won't let this happen," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I will save them, no matter what it takes." Mr. Thompson's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer. "And what will you do, Mrs. Turner?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "Will you defy the Keeper? Will you risk the lives of everyone in this town for the sake of a few disobedient children?" Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, her thoughts racing. She knew that if she tried to fight the town, she would be alone. Mark was already lost to her, and the townspeople would never side with her against the Keeper. She couldn't stand by and let this happen. She had to do something, anything, break the curse that had held these children captive for generations. "I'll find a way," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "I'll find a way to end this." Mr. Thompson's eyes darkened, his expression turning to stone. "Then you leave me no choice," he said, his voice filled with quiet menace. "The silent night is tomorrow, Mrs. Turner. I suggest you reconsider before it's too late." With that, he turned and left the chamber, the door slamming shut behind him, leaving Evelyn alone in the darkness. She sank to the floor, her body trembling as the weight of what she had learned crashed over. Keeper's demand was clear, and the town was ready to comply. But Evelyn knew that she wouldn't stand by and watch the children be sacrificed to a force that fed on their fear. He had one night to stop it, one night to find a way to save them all. Chapter 5: The Choice. The night before the silent night felt endless, a stretch of time that seemed to elongate with each tick of the clock. Every shadow in Stillwater appeared to loom larger. Every whisper of wind seemed to carry a warning. Evelyn sat at the edge of their bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the weight of the town's history pressing down on her. Mark was already asleep, his face peaceful in the dim light. She watched him, searching for some sign of the man she had married. But all she saw was someone who had been swallowed by the darkness of Stillwater, a man who had become a stranger. The realization was like a knife to her heart. Mark was gone, lost to the town's insidious traditions, and there was nothing she could do to bring him back. The choice she faced was clear, yet agonizing. She could flee, escape with Mark while there was still time, leaving the children to their grim fate. The thought of abandoning them filled her with a guilt so profound that it made her stomach churn. But the alternative was even more terrifying, staying and fighting against an ancient force, risking not only her life, but the lives of everyone in the town. Her thoughts spun in a dizzying spiral as she considered the impossible dilemma. Could she really leave these children behind, knowing what awaited them? And yet, Could she really stay, knowing the danger that would follow if she tried to defy the town's will? Desperate for guidance, she reached out to Mark, shaking him gently awake. He stirred, blinking sleepily at her before his eyes focused, and the cold, distant expression returned. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to leave. Tonight, before it's too late. We can't stay here and let this happen." He frowned, his brow furrowing as he sat up. "Evelyn, what are you talking about?" he asked, his tone laced with irritation. "You're overreacting. This is just how things are here. You need to accept that." "No, Mark," she insisted, her voice rising in desperation. "This isn't just about traditions. This is about the lives of those children. If we stay, we're condoning this horror. We have to go now before the silent night begins." Mark stared at her, his expression hardening. "You don't understand," he said, his voice flat. "This town, this place, it's safe, it's peaceful. The people here are good, Evelyn. They know what they're doing. You need to stop fighting it and just accept it." Evelyn felt her heart sink as she realized how far gone he was, how deeply the town's influence had taken hold. "Mark," she pleaded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Please, come with me. We can start over somewhere else, somewhere safe. Please." He shook his head, a look of resignation on his face. "I can't," said quietly. "I belong here now, and so do you. You just need to see that." Finality of his words hit her like a physical blow, and Evelyn knew then she had lost him completely. She felt a deep, aching sadness settle in her chest, but beneath it, a spark of determination flared. If Mark wouldn't leave with her, she would go alone, but not without trying to save the children first. The town was eerily quiet as she slipped out of the house, the night air cool against her skin. She moved quickly, her footsteps barely making a sound, as she made her way to the one place that held the answers she needed: the library. It was there, among the ancient tomes and dusty records, that she had first uncovered the truth about the Keeper. But tonight, she wasn't looking for more history. She was searching for something deeper, something that would help her understand how to break the town's curse. The library was dark, the only light coming from the small flashlight she had brought with her. She moved through the stacks with purpose, her eyes scanning the shelves until she found what she was looking for: a collection of journals written by the town's founders. She flipped through the brittle pages, her heart pounding as she read the accounts of those who had first settled in Stillwater. The early entries spoke of a harsh life, of a town on the brink of collapse until the day the pact was made. The details were vague, shrouded in cryptic language, but the message was clear. Keeper was born from desperation, a manifestation of the townspeople's collective will to survive. It wasn't just a spirit, Evelyn realized with a growing sense of dread. It was the embodiment of the town's fears, its desire for control, its need for order. The children's silence wasn't just a tradition, it was a physical expression of the town's deepest, darkest impulses. As the truth settled over her, Evelyn felt a wave of nausea. The Keeper wasn't an external force, it was a part of the townspeople themselves, a reflection of their subconscious need to maintain the status quo at any cost. And as long as they believed in the Keeper's power, the curse would continue. She closed the journal, her hands trembling. How could she fight something that was woven into the very fabric of the town? How could she break a curse that was enforced by the minds of the people themselves? The weight of the choice before her felt unbearable. If she tried to save the children, she would be going against the will of the entire town. She would be risking everything, her life and possibly the lives of everyone in Stillwater. But if she did nothing, she would be condemning those children to a life of fear and silence, just as countless others before them had been. As she sat there in the dim light of the library, Evelyn realized that the choice was not just about saving the children or saving herself. It was about confronting the darkness that lay at the heart of Stillwater, the darkness that had taken hold of Mark and was now threatening to consume her as well. With a deep breath, she made her decision. She would fight, not just for the children, for the very soul of the town. She would find a way to break the curse, even if it meant facing the Keeper itself, even if it meant standing alone against the collective will of the town. Evelyn stood, her resolve solidifying as she left the library. The night was still and quiet, the the town asleep and unaware of the battle that was about to unfold. Evelyn knew that come morning, everything would be different. She would not let fear control her. She would not let the town's darkness consume her. The keeper's demand had been met for too long. No longer. The time had come for Stillwater to face the truth, and for the silence to be broken, once and for all. Chapter 6. Silent Submission or Defiance. The night had a thick, oppressive weight to it as Evelyn moved through the shadows, her heart hammering in her chest. The town was alive with an unsettling stillness, an anticipation that hung in the air like the calm before a storm. Every window was dark, every door closed, as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when the ritual would begin. Evelyn's footsteps were soundless on the cobblestone streets, but her mind raced with the chaos that she knew was coming. She had no plan, no clear idea of how she would save the children, only the burning conviction that she could not let this night pass without doing something. The thought of those children, standing silent and terrified before that monstrous force, was more than she could bear. She reached the town square just as the procession began. The townspeople, dressed in somber dark clothing, moved with an eerie precision, their faces blank and eyes downcast. And there, at the center of it all, were the children, their small faces pale in the moonlight, their eyes wide with fear. They walked in perfect silence, their steps as soft as whispers, their hands clasped tightly in front of them. At the head of the procession stood Mr. Thompson, his face set in a grim mask of determination. Behind him, a shadowy figure loomed, indistinct and formless, yet exuding a presence that sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine. It was the Keeper, ancient entity that held the town in its grip, the force that demanded obedience and silence in exchange for prosperity. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she watched the children being led toward the dark figure. She knew she had to act, but her body felt paralyzed, as if the very air around her was thick with the town's collective will, pressing down on her, holding her in place. But then, one of the children stumbled. A small boy with wide, terrified eyes. He looked up at her, his gaze pleading, and something within Evelyn snapped. Without thinking, she lunged forward, pushing her way through the crowd, ignoring the startled gasps and the hands that reached out to stop her. She grabbed the boy by the arm, pulling him away from the procession. "Run!" she hissed, her voice low but urgent. "Run and don't look back." For a moment, the boy hesitated, his eyes flicking to the dark figure of the Keeper. But then, as if some primal instinct kicked in, he broke free and ran, his small feet pounding against the cobblestones as he disappeared into the night. The silence that followed was deafening. Townspeople stood frozen, their faces a mask of shock and horror. Mr. Thompson turned slowly to face her, his eyes burning with an anger that sent a chill down her spine. "What have you done?" He hissed, his voice low and dangerous. But before Evelyn could respond, a ripple of movement ran through the crowd. The other children, seeing the boy's defiance, began to stir. One by one, they broke the silence, their voices rising in a crescendo of cries and whispers, a sound that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the night. Keeper recoiled, its shadowy form flickering and shifting as if it was struggling to maintain its grip on the town. For a brief, fleeting moment, Evelyn felt a surge of hope. The children were speaking, the silence was breaking. Perhaps, just perhaps, she had done it. But then, as quickly as it began, the moment was gone. The townspeople, driven by fear and desperation, surged forward, their hands reaching out to the children, silencing them with a ferocity that shocked Evelyn to her core. Mr. Thompson stepped toward her, his face twisted in fury, and Evelyn knew she had no choice but to flee. She turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest, the sound of the children's cries still ringing in her ears. Behind her, the town regained control, the silence descending once more, heavier and more suffocating than ever before. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, growing stronger with every step she took. She reached the edge of town, gasping for breath as she stumbled toward her car. The night was still, the oppressive silence following her like a shadow, wrapping around her like a shroud. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking, and finally managed to start the engine. As she drove away, the town faded into the darkness behind her, but the silence remained. Filled the car, pressing in on her from all sides, a heavy, suffocating presence that seemed to seep into her very soul. The children's voices had been silenced once more, and now that silence had become a part of her, constant reminder of what she had left behind. Tears blurred her vision as she drove, but she did not stop. She couldn't. The road stretched out before her, a narrow ribbon of darkness that seemed to lead nowhere. And yet she drove on, driven by a desperate need to escape the silence that clung to her. But deep down, she knew that she could never truly escape. Silence was not just a part of the town, it was a part of her now. A shadow that would follow her wherever she went. She had tried to defy the Keeper, to break the hold it had on the town, but in the end, she had failed. The silence had won, and it would continue to haunt her the rest of her days. As the miles slipped by, Evelyn realized with a sinking heart that she was not leaving the town behind. The town had left its mark on her, a mark that could never be erased. The silence was a part of her now, and it would remain with her. Constant reminder of the price she had paid for trying to defy the power of Stillwater. And as she drove into the night, the silence in the car grew deeper, more oppressive, till it was all she could hear. The echo of a town that had taken everything from her, a silence that would never, ever let her go.